You sure?
Yeah.
Jordan? Okay. Okay. So, our problem of knowledge is to what extent does language exist in the multiple forms to accumulate diverse knowers? This is a TOK diagram, and then the outside are the areas of knowledge, and we will be looking at history and ethics through language and a little bit of like reasoning to the meaning of language. Our first life example is politics, and it's based on language because it depends on how people like talk in order to get votes for like the president. The different presidents when they run for president, they use specific words in their campaigns in order to like win the votes of people. And I mean, some of them, like with Obama, they say some things, and it's not even, they don't even keep it in their promise to keep it after they become in office, just so they can win the votes. So, for example, Obama had said that he was going to create a foreclosure prevention fund for the homeowners, which never happened. He said that he was going to create it to help the homeowners, but when he did, it failed, and then he never really tried again. So it kind of he just said it in order to get the votes and not go with it.
Okay, so some knowers use a certain type of language that will allow them to gain a certain response. So for our second example, I'm using the one where the time before, right, leading up to World War II, where Hitler had gone to Chamberlain and asked or demanded for Czechoslovakia, and the language that he used had insinuated that had Chamberlain not given him part of Czechoslovakia, then he would start a war. And at the time, Britain, or a war was the last thing that Britain had wanted, so he gave Hitler part of the land. Okay. So some different knowers' perspectives on this event. So a knower's perspective is different ways of viewing an event or an action based off of personal experiences. So each individual person is a knower, and the way that they think is their the way they think is a perspective. So there is deontologist, and one word to remember this is obligation, and they judge an action based off of the morals or ethics that they have. And for consequentialist, a word to remember is outcome, and they judge whether an action is right or wrong based off of the net gain that happens. So for some questions, how do you think a deontologist or consequentialist would react to one of the real-life situations? Bithiah.
Well, a deontologist, in terms of when you're talking about Neville Chamberlain and Hitler discussing Czechoslovakia, they would probably say that it was not ethical that Hitler threatened Neville Chamberlain, because a deontologist really believes that if it is what you're doing is considered wrong, it is wrong. So even if you're lying to save somebody's life, because you lied, it's wrong. So.
Troy.
In your situations, the consequentialist must be able to justify the act of violence in these situations, as well as the resulting effect is overall positive for the people.
Okay. So for our second question, are there any circumstances that are happening today that are similar to these types of situations, such as using a certain language to gain a certain Bithiah?
Trump. This guy uses sensationalism all the time.
I think that all presidential candidates use some kind of like propaganda in order to have like their candidate like stand out.
Troy.
People are constantly increasing the use of language in order to persuade other people to move on.
Okay, before we move on to explaining TOK concepts, we're gonna have some background information about language. So language is a method of communication between humans, either by speaking or writing, or any other form of communication in order to get the information to each other. And then connection to knowledge and its significance is that knowledge is a connection to the way people communicate it in the different ways and the way they speak based on their language, based on the language they pass it with. So it's either biased or not biased. It just depends on the way they're speaking it. And then there's multiple forms of language. So saying one thing in Spanish and then saying the same thing in English to the same person, it can have a fully different effect on a person in another language than it does with the other language. So saying how are you doing in English could mean a different meaning to someone if you say it in Spanish. And then the impact of language, as I said, it just depends on the different languages and how it's communicated to the person and how personal the topic is to the person. So if the topic is very personal to the person that you're talking to, it's going to mean a lot more to him or to her than a topic that is not personal to the person.
So before we discuss how an individual is impacted by language, I'm going to give you some background regarding how people see the origin of language. And there are two main theories that are universally accepted. One is the scientific theory, and the other one is the religious theory. And the scientific theory states that all languages derive from one language. And that is a parallel to the out of Africa theory, which states that everyone originated from Africa, from one place. And this was proposed by a man by the name of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and it was later expanded by Mr. Charles Darwin. And the other theory is religious theory. And as I was doing research, I found it really difficult to see what other religions thought of the origin of language was. And the most common was Abrahamic religions. And this is Judaism and Christianity. And in the Old Testament, Genesis, there's a story about the Tower of Babel. And the story is about an emperor who wanted to build a structure for himself that would reach up to the heavens. But before he can do that, God made it so that everyone spoke different languages. And that language barrier prevented them from building that structure. Language was initially used to communicate information for survival. So during our caveman times, language was mostly used to share and exchange ideas and ways how to do things, such as build fire, how to hunt, how to create weapons. And then over time, as civilizations were created through the advancement of technology, people began to input their own emotions, using language to express their emotions. And then with this, language became rather intimate to an individual, in a sense of security and culture. Because not only that, they used language to pass down and preserve cultural wisdom, such as the travel stories that are passed down from generation to generation. And language, overall, is used to net a culture together, unify a culture together. My question for you guys is language continuously expanding in form and function? If so, how?
I'd say yes, because they're always making additions and changes to the syntax and words in every single language. So it is constantly changing.
Anyone else? Logan?
Language is expanding simply because of new technological applications as well. So from that alone, you have a lot of new vocabulary to create.
Do you have an example?
Well, if you just look at even our CNC class, I mean, 15, 20 years ago, you would have, CNC, that type of technology, or at least the technology implemented in the CNC machine, you wouldn't have the NC file or a lot of the coding
Yeah.
that you do in that class.
And we can also see, for example, net language. It's rather common amongst adolescents our age. The whole acronym LOL, ILY. Does that have the same meaning as, for example, I am laughing out loud, or I love you? We'll discuss that more. Okay. So according to Aristotle, meaning is the link between symbols and their definitions. And the meaning is developed through one's experience, the intentions and thoughts behind it, and the understanding. The understanding it comes from one's personal experience with something and sense perception. So for example, a tree. Someone shows you a tree, and their intentions is to say that this tree means life. Maybe in the past you were born next to a tree. Maybe you're born from a tree. Then you'll see the tree as a sign of fertility. So now you have two meanings of one symbol. And then over time, how people experience things, how people see things and perceive it, determines what meaning they associate things with, connotations. And then for one thing, there could be a whole variety of meanings behind it. There are two common ways, how we analyze language. One is emotive significance, and the other one is emotive neutral language. Emotive significance is how the emotions that are inputted in it. And so, for example, when you're in an argument with your friend, if your friend's being really aggressive, you're going to get aggressive too. You're basing your emotions off that person. You're perceiving their emotions only. Someone calls you fat, and they said it in a really mean way, and you get upset by it. That is because you analyze it through emotive significance. Emotive neutral language is the literal meaning. So you're taking it for a literal meaning. And this is common through negotiations between different countries so they can avoid any conflicts and other problems. And so when you think of subjectivity, which is emotive significance, you think of a pluralist. And that is one who bases off and sees things based on their perception. And the other one is a naturalist, and that you would think of it as objectivity. And that is just seeing it for the literal meaning of it. So language is used to communicate emotions, commands, and information. And these are the three common functions of language: informative, expressive, and directive. Informative is just sharing information. There's truth value to it. It could be true or false. You're just reporting something. Expressive is your more input. For example, poetry, ballads. And then directive is a command. It's basically any statement that is followed by an action. It's an order. And then through these functions, you have multiple forms. The common forms being ceremonial, emphatic, and performative utterances. Ceremonial is a combination of informative, directive, and expressive. This is common in religion and politics. If you see religious texts, they have, for example, the Bible, the 10 Commandments, what to do, and then the emotions behind it, and the informative, talking about how the earth came to be, what will happen in the future, and etc. And the emphatic is small talk. You're almost doing that as to pass time because it's necessary and it's socially appropriate. For example, in the elevator, if you're only with another person, you want to make small talk to avoid awkwardness. And the last one is performative utterances. Statements containing actions. It's not necessarily orders and commands, but it's also the statements that have verbs in it, such as, I did this, I went running. My next question is, are these things constantly abused? Can these things be abused? Yes.
Yeah, I would assume so, especially in the media, because everybody's about getting your attention. So you kind of like abuse, I guess, these different types of
example, like ISIS, they use a combination of this and, of course, the idea of religion for personal gains and power.
Okay, so moving from language, I'm going to be talking about our areas of knowledge. So one of them is history, and history is the study of past events. So not the past itself, but the way that we interact with it. And language has been constantly used throughout history, and despite time moving on, the way that we interact with people has stayed the same. And for example, there are certain symbols that can mean different things. So one of the symbols is yin and yang. So yin and yang is basically they're opposites of each other, but together they make harmony. And so there are also different types of communications that have been used throughout history. So for example, back in the past, we would send smoke signals in signs of warning, and now we could just send text messages or call. And so going back to our real life situations, the politicians are using a certain language in order to gain what they want, despite being from two different time periods. And despite being from two different time periods, the language that they're using is different. So the politician in the first example used money as a sign of gaining their voters, and Hitler used threats in order to gain what he wanted. And our next area of knowing is ethics. And so ethics is basically the moral principles that are keeping us from doing something. So some questions is it right or ethical to use a certain type of language to receive the response that is wanted?
I think it depends on the situation, but honestly, I feel that we change our language, our tone, naturally. Based on the situation, it's just something we do when we're communicating. I see in certain situations where you're lying to somebody or you're trying to promote something that really is not going to give what you're promising, where it would be unethical. But part of it is also that it comes out naturally when we speak.
So so the ethical problem in our two real life situations is that the two politicians were basically controlling what they wanted in the situation. So based off of that, if the type of language used is safe, like in the first real life situation with the use of bribery and money, does it make it any more ethical compared to where Hitler used threats or sign of violence? Elena. Oh. Okay.
Well, I think if they're both abused by, then neither is more ethical.
Elena, did you?
Well, I would say that, talking about if money is more ethical than threats.
Yeah.
That was a question.
Mm-hmm.
No, not necessarily. I don't believe that money would be more ethical because it's like if you're born with money, it's not exactly more like, you live a big whole life and it's not really fair for you to use that. Something.
I feel like they're neither more ethical because the fact that you're doing something like this way or this, like is really out of someone, just makes it bad from the start because then it's not like a true feeling. It's because they're going towards that specific thing, trying to see like which one is less terrible. Yeah.
Sure.
And just going back to the overall field of consequences of this physical, a lot of people are arguing that money is not the other works wrong. So there's a lot of situations where you can lie for maybe the general benefit. I don't know if you have this one right now. add your own with that, but yeah, there's a lot of situations where lying could be justified in consequences.
It's also the readers, they have the most ethical decision in this matter because they're the ones that have to either accept or decline the money.
I think it also just depends on the person. Not everyone's the same. So for someone who doesn't have the same ethics as another person, it's not wrong. But for a person who does have a stronger type of ethics and morals, it would be wrong.
Also, again, what Logan's saying, adding to that, the observation of the person you're talking to. I mean, when we dropped the second bomb in Japan, it was because of a miscommunication. Maybe someone's not trying to purposely change their language to mean something, but the other person perceives it as such, or the opposite, they don't perceive it at all.
So, in conclusion, language exists in many different forms, such as many or threats, and it is used to entice a certain response from different knowers.